Toto and I are back, and we're here to continue our study of Esther. So last week we started talking about the context and kind of putting our study on the map in a time frame. And we looked at Esther in the very beginning of chapter 1, and it talked about the days of King Ahasuerus, who is also King Cyrus, if you're reading out of an NIV translation. And it was during the time frame of the book of Esther is after the exile. So the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar came in and conquered the Jewish people in Jerusalem in 586 BC and then took them back to Babylon. That was the exile. And then about 48 years later, King Cyrus came in, conquered the Babylons, and created the Persian Empire. And so this story takes place after King Cyrus had done that conquering, and the grandson of King Cyrus is King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes. So this is after the exile. So the people under King Cyrus, the Jewish people, were freed to go back to rebuild the temple and the wall. That's the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So anyway, that's where we are in time. So we are going to meet Esther and another very important character, Mordecai, her cousin, today. And we're going to be working in chapters 1 and 2. We're going to try to do 2 chapters a week so that we can finish the study in 6 weeks total. We did our overview last week. So we're launching into Esther chapter 1. And so looking at chapter 1, just in the beginning, we see the setting. There is a huge party going on. There is a banquet. It has lasted 180 days. And the king had invited all of the other kings and princes of the Persian Empire. So this is a big deal. And so what happens then, you can get a feel for, in verses 5 through 8, what this banquet is like and what even that the castle looks like with the white cotton curtains and the fine linen and the purple and silver rings and the marble pillars. So there's lots of extravagance. And so on the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, it says in verse 10, this is key. So the king was drunk. He called in Queen Esther. So these men were sitting around having this huge party, and he wanted to show off his beautiful queen. And so he called her in. But what happens is that he wanted her to come because she was fair to behold. In verse 11 it says, wearing the royal crown in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty. But in verse 12 it says, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. At this the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. So we're going to find out what happens next. But last night in our group, we talked about how the king actually, his response had some grace because he didn't say like off with her head, which, he was completely embarrassed and he was drunk. So that could have happened. But this is the beginning of the end to Queen Vashti when she wouldn't show up. And there's also some disagreement, if you look in scholarly research, as to why she didn't come. And in some of the Jewish literature, it talks about how it says that she is wearing the royal crown, and what it means is wearing only the royal crown, that he wanted Vashti to appear naked before them. So anyway, there's a lot of theories on why. I think the most important thing to know is that Vashti's refusal set up what is to come. And also that there was a huge ripple effect, because now we're going to read about what the king did. So Vashti refused to come at the king's command, completely embarrassed him. And so then the king, what did he do? In verse 13 through 15, then the king consulted the sages who knew the laws, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and custom. So it said, and then according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti? Because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs. So the king was not rash, no off with your head, and he consulted with his sages, which was a positive step, and then he leaned to the law. So he didn't, in some ways I think he abdicated his power. That's my take on it, that he didn't have any compassion for Vashti. He was drunk. So this was a reaction. In fact, we learn later in the beginning of chapter 2 where he remembered her fondly. So I think once he was not drunk anymore, he realized that maybe he made a mistake. But he leaned into the law, he looked to his sages, and they convinced him that a royal order should go out, that Vashti should never appear again before him. And also, there was another part, and I'm looking at verse 19 and 20 here. When the decree was made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women in the entire kingdom will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So Vashti's decision, the decision of one queen, had an entire ripple effect on the kingdom and all the women. And this is something that we talked about in our group, that when we make a decision, there is a ripple effect to those, especially to our closest, our loved ones, right, our families, and that can go out from there. And one of the things that we discussed was we often think of the negative ripple effect of if we do something that's not make a bad decision, that the consequences can affect others. But what about the good ripple effects? What about when we're a good role model as a parent, or when we're doing something positive to shed light in other people's lives and bring the light of Christ, that there can be a very positive ripple effect. So that's something that I think is a good thing to really pray about and think about this week, is what is the ripple effect when you're making decisions? What can we learn from this story? And another thing is that this is a story of a door closing. A door had to close. Vashti's door and her reign had to end before Queen Esther's could begin. So what doors maybe in your life, again, bringing this home, something to pray about and think about, is what doors need to close so that other doors can open. And this can be relationships. Sometimes we linger. I think as single people, it can be a tendency. Well, maybe not for me, no. Actually, we talked about that last night, that we can stay in relationships too long because they're comfortable. They're comfortable. And sometimes we need to end something so something new can begin. And maybe it's a bad habit. Maybe it's even a career move to open up a new door. So be thinking about that this week. And one thing that we're going to continue to talk about through this study is God. The word God is not mentioned in Esther, but it is all over it. And I think in chapter 1, it's very evident that God is preparing the way, paving the way for Esther. Because without Vashti's exit, we would not have Esther's beginning. So let's look at Esther's beginning in chapter 2. Here we go. Esther chapter 2. So we are going to meet, we're going to meet Mordecai in chapter 5. But before that, let's start in the very beginning of chapter 2. It talked about in verse 1 how when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And that remembered had a fond, positive memory. So I think he might have had some regret there. But then it quickly moves right into having the selection process of young virgins and how they were all gathered up. And Esther was one of these young virgins. But remember, she is not a Persian. She is a Jew. And she is going to be keeping her identity a secret. And you'll see why in a few minutes here. So anyway, there's this huge selection process and this gathering and this preparation of all the virgins. And then at verse 5 it says, "Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite." So he was from Jerusalem. He was part of the exile with Esther. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem. So Kish, the father of Mordecai, among the captives carried away with King Jehoiakim of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. So remember, that is the whole story of the exile in 586 when Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians. So Mordecai's father, Kish, had been carried away, and so now we hear about Mordecai. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther. So that's her Persian name, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother, so Esther had lost her parents. And the girl was fair and beautiful. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther, this is verse 10, did not reveal her people or kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. So a lot is going on here. So just unpacking that a little bit. So Esther is the cousin of Mordecai, and her Hebrew name is Hadassah, not her Persian name. I'm sorry, her Persian name is Esther, and it means star. And so she's about 14 years old, she's a virgin, and she is being prepared for the king among thousands of other virgins throughout the kingdom. And Mordecai has given her the advice to keep her identity a secret, because she is in the selection process to be the Persian queen, and she's a Jew. So anyway, Mordecai, none of this would happen if it wasn't for Mordecai pouring into Esther. And so it reminds me of the people who have poured into my life and have been mentors to me, that we all need a Mordecai. In fact, I always say that this book could be not the book of Esther, it could be the book of Mordecai, because without Mordecai helping behind the scenes, and we'll see it throughout the story, he's kind of checking on her and giving her advice, that Esther could not have done this alone, and none of us can. We need mentors and people in our lives. So what is it about Esther? What was it? And we can see throughout this second chapter of Esther that there are several things. In verse 10, it says that she did not reveal her identity, as I just read. So that is a wise move at this point, because that would have eliminated her immediately. She asked for nothing in verse 15, it says. So she was very humble. And when all these other women making requests, Esther didn't want anything. She was obedient to Mordecai, and we'll see that in verse 20. And she obviously was very submissive to authority, because she was taken kind of into this custody, into the selection process, and very submissive, of course, to Mordecai and looking up to him. So there was just something about Esther. And she got the attention of all. And she eventually, when she came before the king, when it was her turn, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen, instead of Vashti. I love how they just put that in there, kind of a reminder that Vashti's gone and now we've got a new queen. That was Esther, verse 2, 16 through 17. So, of course, what comes next? A banquet. There are banquets. We had one in the first chapter. Now we have one in the second chapter. They're all throughout. A lot of things happen over a banquet in the story. But we do not want to forget a very, very important part of the story, which comes starting in verse 21 through 23. So I'm going to read it because we need to remember this. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, because remember he was at the king's gate, or that shows that he was some sort of officer, and he had some sort of position, sitting at the gate. Bithan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. So we have a murder plot in progress. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. So she's newly crowned queen. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And then when the affair was investigated and found to be so, both the men were hanged on the gallows, so everybody could see. That's what they did. And it was recorded in the book of annals in the presence of the king. This is very, very important. So, in the very end of the second chapter, Mordecai uncovers a murder plot, a plot to kill the king. He goes to Esther, and Esther tells the king Now, this takes a lot of courage because we will learn in verse 4:14 that if anyone appears before the king without being summoned, they could die unless the golden scepter is drawn out and put forth. That could be Esther's end. So Esther really, really must have trusted Mordecai to go to her, and for her to go, to the king. And it was recorded. So no reward at this time, but it was recorded in the book. So, dun, da, da, dum, there is a plot being set, and it's going to be good. And I am going to give you a glimpse of next week. So Mordecai just saves the king's life, and in verse 3:1 it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. Haman, who is Haman? Well, he's the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all other officials who were with him. So, this is very confusing. Mordecai just unveiled the plot to assassinate the king, and Haman gets promoted. This makes no sense. Has that ever happened to you where someone else gets promoted for the work you did? Well, it happened right here in Esther. So tune in. This is getting very good. Haman is a very important figure. So again, as you think about and you pray about this study and let these words work through you, the scripture, I hope that you reflect on how God is working in your life. Because now in chapter 2, we see God clearly setting the stage. So in chapter 1, he was preparing by creating an opening for this new queen, and now he has put a very unlikely person on the throne of Persia, this huge kingdom. So God chooses very unlikely people. And sometimes we feel like we're not equipped. Well, think about 14-year-old virgin Esther being in her secret identity and that secret that she was carrying. She probably didn't feel equipped either. But she gets the job done. And we're going to find out as our story continues. So tune in next week. And I hope, as I said, that this study will create an awareness and raise awareness of how God is working in your life. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.